Have you ever looked up at the night sky, maybe on a really clear night, like far away from all the city lights, and just felt this sudden, almost dizzying sense of vertigo?
Oh, absolutely. Like you're going to fall upward into it.
Yeah, exactly. You're staring up at those, countless points of light, and suddenly you start wondering, where exactly does the line between astrophysics and theology actually sit? Like, where does the physics equation end and
Yeah.
the philosophical or even spiritual question begin?
Right, because looking at that scale, it forces a collision between what we can, empirically measure and what we can only philosophically wonder about.
Totally.
And most people just assume that collision has to be this violent car crash, right? That science and faith are just fundamentally incompatible. But we are exploring a framework today that suggests they are actually driving in the exact same direction.
Which is why we are jumping straight into Chapter 6 of a really fascinating text today. It's called Analyses Biblico-Scientificas, which translates to Biblical-Scientific Analyses, and it's written by Ozair da Silva Mota.
It's a fantastic read.
It really is. And the mission of this deep dive is to synthesize these two realms that modern culture, often treats as mortal enemies. Mota presents this incredibly detailed, rigorous scientific approach to the origins of the universe, and then he places it squarely alongside a profound biblical and theological approach.
And he does this without, watering down the physics or compromising the theology at all.
Right, because what stands out immediately in Mota's writing is his total rejection of the premise that you have to choose a side. I mean, he builds his argument on this idea that truth, by definition, is unified.
Exactly. If a scientific discovery is demonstrably true and a theological principle is fundamentally true, well, they cannot contradict one another in reality. Any perceived contradiction is really just a flaw in, human interpretation.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the core premise of Mota's source material is that science is not some secular threat to faith. Instead, he presents science as the act of reading God's second book.
The second book, right.
Yeah. If the first book is scripture-like, the written revelation, the second book is the architecture of nature itself, the physical universe.
Which completely reframes the entire scientific endeavor, honestly. Under Mota's framework, doing the grueling, complex work of astrophysics or biology or quantum mechanics, it isn't a secular rebellion.
Not at all.
It's the active attempt to decode the mechanisms of creation. It's this persistent march to understand the cosmos, and he argues that when you do that sincerely, you inevitably stumble upon the fingerprints of an architect.
But if we're going to read this second book,
Yes.
right, if we're going to look at the physical architecture of the universe from page 1, well, we have to start at the Big Bang.
We have to.
And before we get into the math and, the physics of it, we really need to clear up what that theory actually claims, because Mota points out there is a massive amount of public misconception and, frankly, a lot of reactionary fear, especially within certain religious communities.
Yeah, the author is very direct about addressing that fear. He posits that religious communities should never shy away from rigorous academic investigation. I mean, the Big Bang is currently the most robust academic theory we have regarding the origin of the cosmos.
Right.
The problem arises because the general public fundamentally misunderstands the scope of what the Big Bang actually describes.
Because people hear Big Bang and they assume, science is claiming to know exactly how the universe just popped into existence out of absolute nothingness.
Which it doesn't.
Right. Mota clarifies that the Big Bang does not explain the absolute first cause. It does not explain what existed before time or before space began.
The Big Bang theory does not describe nothingness. It doesn't even attempt to describe what might exist outside the universe. What the mathematics and the observable data actually describe is just cosmic evolution.
Evolution of what was already there.
Exactly. It traces the development of the universe from a primordial state of incomprehensible density and heat outward to the accelerating vastness we measure today. It is a narrative of unfolding development, not a definitive explanation of ultimate origination.
Which is why Mota addresses the tension people feel when they read the Genesis account. Because a lot of people read the creation narrative and say, well, this doesn't sound like a textbook on cosmic expansion and thermal radiation.
And Mota's counterargument is essentially, why would it?
Right. The Bible was never intended to be an astrophysics manual.
Yeah.
Let's do a thought experiment based on the text, because I think it really highlights the absurdity of expecting it to be one.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine God trying to explain the complexities of quantum mechanics or cosmic inflation or the mathematical constants of thermodynamics to a group of ancient Hebrews who had literally just escaped Egyptian slavery.
The pedagogy would be completely non-functional. I mean, you are dealing with an ancient pre-scientific culture.
Yeah.
They didn't have the conceptual framework, the vocabulary, or the mathematical foundation to process concepts like space-time curvature or subatomic particles. In their cultural and historical context, the sky was perceived as a solid dome.
Right. So the Genesis narrative is not focused on the technical how. It focuses heavily on the who.
Yeah.
It's a theological declaration establishing that an eternal intellect is the driving force behind the physical reality.
It's about establishing authority and purpose, not handing over mathematical blueprints.
Right.
And Mota also brings up a vital distinction regarding the nature of science itself, which I think really helps contextualize the Big Bang. We have to differentiate between a scientific law and a scientific theory.
This is an important distinction.
It really is. A scientific law, like the law of universal gravitation, describes a phenomenon that can be repeatedly tested and verified in an empirical setting. You can measure gravitational acceleration in a laboratory in London, and you can measure it on the surface of the moon. It is universally observable in the present tense.
But you can't put the birth of the universe in a lab.
Precisely. Cosmic evolution is macrohistorical. We cannot throw the entire universe into a particle accelerator to run the experiment again.
That would be a very big lab.
Yeah, incredibly big. So because of this limitation, the Big Bang remains a theory. Now, in the realm of academic rigor, a theory is not just a mere guess, right?
Not a hunch.
No, it is an incredibly complex, highly supported matrix of ideas that best explains the observable phenomena. It is the most accurate map we have, but Mota reminds us it is still a map of development.
Which is why the author argues that for a believer, this shouldn't be threatening at all. The text references Romans 1.1920, which basically suggests that the invisible attributes of the Creator are perceived through the physical things that have been made.
The second book.
Exactly. Studying the cosmos, mapping the trajectory of galaxies, is essentially an act of worship. It's trying to read the mind of the engineer.
And to truly grasp the magnitude of what that engineering entails, Mota invites the reader to engage in a really profound mental exercise. It requires us to stretch human cognition in two completely opposite extreme directions, the infinitely large and the infinitesimally small.
Let's do that zoom-out exercise right now. For you listening, think about your immediate physical world, the room you're in. Now expand your mental picture to your neighborhood, then your city.
Getting bigger.
Yeah. Now visualize the entire planet Earth, a massive sphere of rock and iron and water, just suspended in a vacuum. Keep zooming out to the solar system. You've got the sun, the gas giants, the asteroid belts.
At this point, the human mind is already struggling with the scale, but we haven't even started.
Not even close. Push out into the Milky Way galaxy. The text reminds us that our local galaxy alone contains hundreds of billions of suns.
Hundreds of billions.
And we are just one galaxy. Now take that mind-boggling scale and multiply it by billions of other galaxies scattered across the observable universe.
The immensity completely shatters human quantification. I mean, we can write down the numbers, sure, we can use exponential notation, but visualizing the true physical volume of the cosmos is biologically impossible for us.
Hold on to that feeling of impossible vastness. Just hold it. Because Mota asks us to reverse the journey and plunge into the microscopic. Look at something tiny, like the point of a fine needle.
Okay.
Now zoom into that tip until you reach a single atom. To contextualize this scale from the text, you would have to take a single centimeter and divide it into 1 trillion equal parts, just to isolate an atom.
A trillionth of a centimeter.
Yeah. And yet, the physics of the origin requires us to go drastically smaller than that.
Right, because Mota details that when astrophysicists run the cosmic mathematical clock backward, when they calculate the reversal of the expansion we see today, they compress that entire observable universe, all those billions of galaxies, all those hundreds of billions of suns, into a spatial dimension that makes an atom look like a continent.
Wait, how small are we talking?
The theoretical mathematics point to a primordial state where the entirety of the universe's mass and energy was concentrated into a singular point, measuring just 1 × 10⁻³ centimeters.
So there's a decimal point.
A decimal point followed by 32 zeros and a 1.
Trillions of times smaller than an atom, and it's containing the mass of literally everything that exists.
Everything. At this microscopic point, which cosmology terms the singularity, the density was absolute. And the temperature, according to the models Mota cites, was roughly 1 × 10⁻³ Kelvin, a 1 followed by 33 zeros.
I always struggle with this part because there is no logical framework in our everyday experience that can process that level of heat and density. It just sounds like numbers on a chalkboard.
And that is exactly Mota's point. What's fascinating here is that the singularity is not just a really hot, really small dot in space. The singularity represents an epistemological barrier.
A barrier to knowledge.
Right. It is the literal wall of science. This is where human reason and mathematical modeling touch the incomprehensible. Because at that specific point of infinite density and infinite temperature, the fundamental laws of physics that govern our reality completely break down.
Wait, unpack that for a second. What do you mean they break down? Do they just stop working?
Essentially, yes. The equations we rely on, like classical Newtonian physics, Einstein's general relativity, even the strange rules of quantum mechanics, they all lose their predictive power.
They just fail.
They fail. At the singularity, gravity becomes so intensely magnified at a subatomic scale that relativity and quantum mechanics, which normally govern the large and the small respectively, are forced into a paradox. The mathematical equations literally yield infinities. They produce nonsense results.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, science literally cannot tell us what was happening at that exact moment of zero.
Yeah. That is the consensus Mota relies on. The physical sciences can only confidently begin to describe the mechanics of the universe starting at a fraction of a second after the initial event. Specifically, around the Planck time, but certainly by 0.01 seconds after the beginning.
100th of a second.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Mota highlights that in that fleeting instant 0.01 seconds after the start, the universe had already undergone cosmic inflation. It had expanded at a velocity exceeding the speed of light.
Faster than light.
Faster than light. Leaping from the infinitesimal subatomic realm into astronomical dimensions in the literal blink of an eye. It is only from that fraction of a second onward that the cosmic temperature dropped just enough for the forces of nature to separate, and the history of the cosmos begins to be written in a physical language our current models can read.
Which naturally leads to the biggest skeptical pushback, right? If no human observer was there, and the very laws of physics break down at the starting line, how can scientists possibly know this sequence of events actually happened?
Right. How is it not just a guess?
Yeah, how is this the most robust theory we have?
It's the necessary question. And Mota spends a significant portion of the chapter addressing the physical evidence that the universe left behind. The source breaks down two fundamental pillars of observable data that allow cosmologists to reconstruct this past.
The first pillar relies on an acoustic analogy that we experience all the time. Mota introduces a 19th century Austrian physicist named Christian Andreas Doppler, and he applies his findings to the cosmos.
Ah, the Doppler effect.
Exactly. Picture yourself standing on a sidewalk near a hospital. You hear an ambulance coming toward you, siren just blaring. As it approaches, the pitch of that siren is high, almost piercing. Mota describes the sound waves as being squeezed.
Squeezed together.
Right. But the exact second that ambulance passes you and starts driving away, the pitch immediately drops. It sounds lower, more grave.
And the mechanical siren on the ambulance isn't changing. The driver isn't, like, manually altering the pitch on the dashboard. The shift in the sound frequency happens entirely because of the movement of the object emitting the waves relative to your stationary position.
As it moves towards you, the sound waves are compressed, creating a higher frequency. As it moves away, the waves stretch out, creating a lower frequency. But how does an ambulance siren help us understand the birth of the universe?
Because the exact same wave dynamics apply to light. While Doppler was studying acoustics, light also behaves as a wave. Mota introduces the fundamental mathematical relationship here. Velocity equals wavelength multiplied by frequency.
Okay, keeping the math simple.
Right, because the speed of light in a vacuum is a constant. If the wavelength of light changes, the frequency has to inversely change to compensate.
Meaning, if a star or a galaxy in space is moving toward Earth, its light waves get squeezed, just like the approaching siren. And if it's moving away, the light waves get stretched.
Precisely. And when we look at the visual spectrum of light, shorter, squeezed wavelengths shift toward the blue end of the spectrum. Longer, stretched wavelengths shift toward the red end. So if a celestial object is moving away from us, the light we receive from it will appear slightly redder than it actually was when it was emitted.
And in astrophysics, this is known as redshift.
Yes, redshift.
Which brings us to the monumental discovery in 1920 by Edwin Hubble. He's looking through the massive Hooker telescope at the Mount Wilson Observatory, analyzing the light spectra coming from distant galaxies, and he makes an observation that just shatters the prevailing scientific consensus of the time.
Because Up until that point, the prevailing belief, even held by Albert Einstein, mind you, was that the universe was static. It was just a fixed, eternal room. But Hubble realized that almost every distant galaxy he observed was exhibiting a redshift.
That light waves were stretching,
The light waves were stretched.
meaning they were all moving away from us.
And Hubble discovered a specific pattern to this movement. Mota explains Hubble's law. The speed at which a galaxy is receding from Earth is directly proportional to its distance from Earth. The further away a galaxy is, the faster it is moving away.
Mota uses a brilliant visual analogy here. He says, to imagine the universe not as a static room, but as a tapestry that is actively being stretched out in all directions. If you paint dots on a balloon and inflate it, every dot moves away from every other dot.
What's fascinating here is that this expansion is the critical proof, because if you apply basic deductive logic to that expansion, if everything is moving further apart today, it implies that yesterday they were closer together.
Right.
A million years ago, they were much closer. And if you run that mathematical trajectory in reverse, derived from the basic physics of velocity and distance over time, you inevitably converge on a singular starting point.
That expanding tapestry is the first pillar. But Mota then details the second massive pillar of evidence, which he calls the thermal echo, or the cosmic microwave background radiation, the CMB.
The logic here is straightforward, but profound. If the universe truly originated from a microscopic state of unimaginably intense heat, that 1 × 10 to the 33rd Kelvin we discussed earlier, that thermal energy couldn't just vanish into nothingness. The laws of thermodynamics dictate that there must be a residual heat signature left over from that initial expansion.
Because the expansion of the universe is considered relatively homogeneous and isotropic, meaning it looks generally the same in all directions on a grand scale, this leftover heat shouldn't be isolated to one specific corner of the sky. It should be a uniform bath of radiation permeating the entire cosmos.
And Mota points out the historical timeline of this discovery. This residual background heat was mathematically predicted by cosmologists back in the 1940s, decades before our technology could actually detect it. They argued that if the Big Bang model was correct, this thermal echo must exist.
Fast forward to 1965. Two researchers, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, were working with a highly sensitive horn antenna at Bell Labs. They kept picking up this strange, persistent, low-level static.
Just a hum.
Yeah, a microwave noise that came from every single direction they pointed the antenna, day or night. They actually initially thought it was pigeon droppings in the equipment causing interference.
They literally cleaned the antenna, but the signal remained. They had accidentally stumbled upon the exact thermal echo predicted by the theoretical physicists decades earlier. Penzias and Wilson won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1978 for this discovery.
Wow.
It is a faint, incredibly cold glow of microwave radiation, just a few degrees above absolute zero today, that fills the universe.
And Mota notes that in 1992, NASA's COBE satellite mapped this radiation across the entire sky with incredible precision. Mota refers to this as the oldest photograph of the universe. It is the thermal snapshot of the exact era when the universe cooled down enough for the first atoms to form, allowing light to finally travel freely through space.
The redshift confirms the mechanical expansion, and the cosmic microwave background confirms the initial intense thermal state. The physical evidence for the development of the cosmos is thoroughly established. But Mota uses this established science to pivot toward a massive philosophical and theological inquiry.
Because if the science undeniably proves that the universe is expanding outward from a singular starting point, we have to transition from asking how it developed to asking who or what caused that initial expansion to begin. Does a universe of this scale even require a cause?
Mota contrasts two fundamentally opposed worldviews here. On one side, you have the purely materialist perspective. This is a worldview that posits the physical universe is entirely self-sufficient. It requires no external author.
Mota illustrates this by quoting the famous astronomer Carl Sagan, who famously declared, "The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be." The philosopher Bertrand Russell echoed this sentiment, arguing that the universe doesn't require an explanation. Its existence is simply a brute fact. You don't need to look for a creator, because the raw existence of the universe is the ultimate baseline reality.
The materialist argument relies on the assumption that if you trace causality back far enough, you simply stop at the universe itself. But Mota challenges the logical consistency of this brute fact argument using a highly effective philosophical thought experiment.
It's an adaptation of a parable originally framed by the philosopher Norman Geisler. Mota asks us to imagine two friends walking along a trail in a completely virgin, untouched, ancient forest. One friend is a layman, an average observer. The other is a strict materialist physicist.
Okay, setting a scene.
As they're walking through this wild brush, they stumble upon an anomaly. It's a perfectly smooth, highly polished, spherical metal object about 10 centimeters across, just resting perfectly on a lily pad.
The layman naturally looks at it and asks, how did this get here?
And the physicist, applying basic deductive reasoning, says, well, obviously an intelligent agent placed it there. A highly ordered, perfectly geometric metal sphere doesn't just spontaneously assemble itself from the dirt in the middle of a forest. It demands a cause. Someone designed it, and someone moved it.
So on a small scale, they both agree. An ordered anomaly requires an external cause.
But the layman decides to test the limits of this logic. He asks the physicist, okay, what if we walked further and found a metal sphere the size of a car? Would you still assume someone put it there?
And the physicist says?
The physicist laughs and says, of course. The sheer size doesn't negate the logic of causality. If anything, a car-sized sphere demands an even larger investigation into who possessed the engineering capability to manufacture it and transport it into this isolated forest.
The requirement for a cause scales proportionally with the magnitude and complexity of the effect.
Exactly. So the layman delivers the philosophical punchline. He asks, what if that sphere was so unimaginably massive that it was the size of the entire observable universe? What if it contained all the galaxies, the quasars, the complex laws of physics and biological life? Does that cosmic-sized sphere still demand a cause and a designer?
And here is where Mota points out the glaring contradiction in the materialist worldview. The materialist physicist would suddenly abandon his previous logic and claim, no, a universe-sized sphere does not need a cause. It simply is. It is the brute fact.
Mota argues this is a massive logical fallacy. By what rational mechanism does an object become so large and its internal system so complex that it suddenly becomes entirely exempt from the fundamental law of cause and effect?
That doesn't make sense.
Right. If a 10-centimeter sphere demands a designer because of its order, a universe of billions of light years, governed by precise mathematical constants, demands one infinitely more.
Mota concludes that the undeniable existence and expansion of the universe points unequivocally toward a first cause. And logically, a cause must inherently possess the capacity and superiority to produce its effect. If the resulting effect is a universe of incomprehensible energy, spatial immensity, and ordered physical laws, then the cause must possess the attributes necessary to generate those realities.
Meaning the cause must be omnipotent, possessing limitless power to generate the mass and energy. It must be omniscient, possessing the supreme intellect required to calibrate the delicate laws of physics. And it must be eternal, existing completely outside the boundaries of the time and space that it brought into existence.
For Mota and for the theological framework he represents, this first cause is not an abstract force. It has a name, and its deliberate engineering is evident in the architecture of reality. But Mota also anticipates the strongest counterargument from the skeptical side.
Right. What if Sagan was correct in his premise, and the universe is eternal? What if the cosmos simply always existed, stretching infinitely backward into the past, without any definitive starting line? If there is no beginning, there is no need for a first cause to push the starting block.
To dismantle the idea of an eternal, past infinite universe, Mota turns to the ultimate, unforgiving arbiters of physical reality, the laws of thermodynamics. Specifically, he relies on the interplay between the first and second laws, which act as a cosmic clock proving the finitude of the universe.
Let's really break down thermodynamics because it is the linchpin of Mota's argument here.
It's crucial.
The first law of thermodynamics is the principle of the conservation of energy. It states that energy cannot be created out of nothing, and it cannot be destroyed into nothing. It can only be transferred or transformed from one state to another. If you burn a log of wood, the chemical energy stored in the wood doesn't cease to exist. It transforms into thermal energy heat and radiant energy light.
The total sum of energy within the closed system of the universe remains absolutely constant. But it is the second law of thermodynamics that provides the definitive answer to the eternal universe question. The second law introduces a concept known as entropy.
Entropy is broadly defined as the measure of disorder or randomness within a closed system.
More specifically, on a thermodynamic level, the second law dictates that in any closed system, entropy is relentlessly increasing. Order naturally decays into disorder. While the first law ensures the total amount of energy remains the same, the second law ensures that the amount of usable energy that is concentrated enough to actually perform work is constantly decreasing as it disperses.
So what does this all mean? Mota provides a fantastic grounded analogy to explain how entropy acts as a clock. He asks the reader to imagine going on a road trip, specifically driving from Curitiba to Foz do Iguaçu in Brazil.
A beautiful drive.
Yeah. You pull into a gas station, and you pump exactly 40 liters of gasoline into your car's fuel tank.
That tank of liquid gasoline represents a state of low entropy. It is highly organized, concentrated, chemically potent energy. It is highly usable.
You start the engine and hit the highway. As the engine combusts that fuel, the first law of thermodynamics guarantees that the 40 liters worth of energy is not being destroyed.
Yeah.
But what is happening to it?
It's changing states.
The highly organized molecular structure of the gasoline is violently broken down. It is transformed into kinetic energy, moving the car forward, but a massive amount of it is lost as radiant heat coming off the engine block, water vapor expelled from the exhaust pipe, and dispersed carbon emissions.
The energy is scattering. It is moving from a concentrated state to a highly chaotic, disorganized state. The total energy in the universe remains the same, but you cannot drive your car backward, suck up the exhaust smoke and the engine heat, and reconstitute it into 40 liters of liquid gasoline.
That would be magic.
Right. The process is irreversible. The usable energy has been permanently spent. Entropy has increased.
And as you are driving toward Foz do Iguaçu, you constantly monitor your fuel gauge. Why? Because you inherently understand that your energy source is limited. If the energy in your gas tank were truly eternal and infinite, the concept of a fuel gauge would be absurd. The car would simply drive forever.
Which it obviously doesn't.
The only reason the fuel eventually runs out is because the supply had a finite beginning. It was introduced into the system at a specific, localized moment in the past.
Mota applies this exact thermodynamic road trip to the entirety of the cosmos. If time, space, and energy were truly infinite in the past, if the universe had been existing and burning energy for a literal eternity stretching backward without end, the universe would have already run out of usable gas.
Given an infinite amount of time to process a finite amount of total energy, the second law dictates that the universe would have reached a state of maximum entropy an eternity ago.
Cosmologists refer to this theoretical state as the heat death of the universe. It describes a cosmos where all thermal gradients have leveled out. There would be no concentrated pockets of energy left to ignite stars. It would be a uniformly cold, dark, inert vacuum of dead matter, incapable of sustaining any physical processes, let alone biological life.
But when we point our telescopes at the sky, or just look out the window, a dead universe is not what we observe. We see an incredibly active cosmos. We see massive stars furiously burning hydrogen. We see galaxies swirling with dynamic energy. And we see a planet pulsing with complex biological life.
The universe is clearly not at maximum entropy.
There's still a massive amount of usable fuel in the cosmic tank.
And Mota draws the unavoidable logical conclusion. Because the usable energy has not yet run out, the cosmic clock could not have been ticking forever. If time were an infinite line backward, we would already be at heat death. Therefore, time itself cannot be infinite. It must be a finite segment.
The universe must have a beginning. It had to be fueled up and wound up at a specific point in the past, specific yesterday.
Mota emphasizes that if you possess a timeline that is fundamentally finite, and you trace that line all the way backward to its very first increment, you inevitably hit an absolute origin point. You hit the boundary where the system was activated.
And if we trace that finite cosmic line all the way back to the singularity, pushing past the wall of physics at 1 times 10 to the negative 33rd centimeters, we hit a total void. Absolute conceptual nothingness, no space, no dimension, no time, no matter.
Nothing.
And Mota poses the ultimate philosophical dilemma. How do you transition from an absolute void of nothingness to the unimaginable complexity of everything we see today?
Confronted with that void, Mota argues that human logic only has 2 available premises to explain the origin of reality. The first premise is the self-generation of nothing. This is the proposition that nothing, a state which, by strict definition, possesses no physical properties, no dimensions, no governing laws, and no potential energy, somehow, completely spontaneously and without any external cause, generated everything out of its own non-existence.
Which fundamentally violates the most basic axioms of logic and philosophy. From nothing, nothing comes. Nothing cannot act as an agent of creation because it has no ontological reality.
Since the first premise is logically incoherent, Mota moves to the second and only remaining logical premise, a transcendent cause, an external initiating agent, one that is eternal, immaterial, and infinite in capability, existing independently of the newly created physical laws, who brought the universe into existence ex nihilo. out of absolutely nothing.
And Mota doesn't just stop at a generic, chaotic creator. To demonstrate that this transcendent cause was exercising deliberate, masterful intention, that the universe wasn't just a haphazard cosmic accident, he dives into the concept of fine-tuning.
The physics of the Big Bang are governed by a series of fundamental constants and mathematical parameters, things like the strength of gravity, the electromagnetic force, the ratio of masses between protons and electrons, and the exact rate of initial spatial expansion.
Mota points out that if any of these parameters were altered by even a microscopic fraction, the universe would have either instantly collapsed back in on itself into a black hole, or expanded so rapidly that matter could never coalesce to form galaxies, stars, or planets. Life would be physically impossible.
The author cites a staggering statistic to quantify this required precision. The mathematical probability of the initial conditions of the Big Bang randomly aligning to produce a life-sustaining universe is calculated at an order of 1 in 10 to the 60th power.
1 in 10 to the 60th power. To give us a visceral understanding of how absurdly precise that number is, Mota provides an incredible visualization. Imagine you are a marksman, and you are aiming at a target that is only 2.5 centimeters wide, about the size of a small coin.
But you are not standing in a shooting range.
No. You are positioned a distance of 20 billion light years away from the target,
Right.
across the entire span of the cosmos. And you have to pull the trigger and hit that 2.5 centimeter target dead center on your very first try.
That level of incomprehensible mathematical exactness is what was required for reality to exist in its current form. Mota argues that this degree of precision utterly destroys the idea of a blind, chaotic accident. It is the hallmark of meticulous, deliberate orchestration.
And here is where Mota flawlessly merges the astrophysics back into the theology. This concept of a transcendent cause bringing ordered reality out of an absolute void through divine engineering finds its perfect linguistic and theological counterpart in the very first sentence of the biblical text, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Mota draws intense focus to the specific Hebrew vocabulary used in that ancient text, specifically the verb used for created, which is bara.
The author explains that biblical Hebrew contains several different verbs used to describe the act of making or forming something. Words like isa or yatsar, which generally imply taking pre-existing raw material and fashioning it into something new, like a potter taking a lump of existing clay and molding it into a vessel, or a carpenter carving a chair out of existing wood.
But Mota emphasizes that the word bara is entirely unique in the biblical lexicon. It is a verb whose subject is exclusively God. It is never used to describe a human action, and more importantly, it does not imply the reshaping or reorganization of eternally existing primordial matter.
Bara evokes the specific, staggering act of creating out of absolute nothingness. It is the theological articulation of the ex nihilo singularity.
Mota supports this by weaving in New Testament theology. He references Romans 4:17, which describes the Creator as the one who calls into existence the things that do not exist. He also cites Hebrews 11:3. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible.
The theology of the first century is perfectly describing the cosmological physics of the 21st century. Mota was showing how the scientific model of a universe erupting from a dimensionless point perfectly shakes hands with the ancient revelation of Bara.
The physics in the scriptures are describing the exact same event using completely different lexicons.
It's a beautiful synthesis. But I have to step in here and push back hard on behalf of anyone listening who is familiar with the timeline debate.
Yeah.
Because there is a massive glaring tension that we haven't resolved yet.
The chronological friction.
Yes. When science uses the expansion rate of light, the measurements of the cosmic microwave background, and radiometric dating of isotopes, it overwhelmingly concludes that this cosmic evolutionary process took roughly 13.8 or 14 billion years. The physical universe looks incredibly old.
Right.
But a literal traditional theological reading of the Genesis creation week implies a timeline that is exponentially younger. Thousands of years, not billions.
It is the most common point of conflict between the two disciplines.
So how does Mota reconcile this? If God is the author of the Big Bang, how do we bridge the gap between billions of years of measurable cosmic history and a young creation narrative? If the universe is actually young, but it looks 14 billion years old, isn't God essentially faking the data? Is he planting false evidence in the starlight and the rocks to trick our telescopes and our radiometric dating methods?
Mota tackles this exact accusation of divine deception by introducing a profound theological and philosophical concept known as a maturidade creata, or created maturity.
Created maturity. Let's dig deeply into this because Mota's argument hinges on it. And he uses two distinct biblical analogies to explain how maturity can exist without lived history. The first one relies on the biology of the first human, Adam.
The biblical narrative of Adam's creation requires him to be instantly functional from the moment he takes his first breath. He was given immediate responsibilities. He had to tend and cultivate the garden environment. He had to possess the cognitive ability to name the animals. He had to be able to exercise complex moral free will, and he was given the biological mandate to procreate.
Which means God could not have created Adam as a single-cell zygote, or an embryo, or even a helpless infant. He required a fully developed, physiologically mature, adult bodily form instantaneously.
So Mota asks the reader to visualize a scenario. Imagine a modern medical researcher, equipped with our best diagnostic technology, is able to travel back in time to the Garden of Eden, arriving exactly 5 minutes after Adam was created.
Okay, time-traveling doctor.
Right. Adam is chronologically a 5-minute-old organism. The researcher sits Adam down, draws his blood, measures his bone density, examines the enamel on his teeth, and looks at his cellular structure. What does the empirical data tell the researcher?
Well, if the researcher is relying solely on the physical evidence, they are going to conclude they are examining an adult male who is, say, 25 or 30 years old. The scientific data would indicate a body that had survived years of childhood growth spurts, cellular division, immune system development, and skeletal calcification. The researcher would confidently state, this man has a 30-year physical history.
But the objective reality is that he only has a 5-minute chronological history. The physical evidence points to a biological past that Adam never actually lived through in real time.
And here is where we address the deception question. Was God trying to trick that hypothetical time-traveling researcher?
Mota argues no.
Right. The apparent age wasn't an act of deception. It was an act of functional necessity. Adam had to be created with mature systems in order to survive and fulfill his immediate purpose. He was, as Mota might phrase it, created in flight.
The author then pairs this biological analogy with a chemical analogy from the New Testament, the wedding at Cana, where Jesus performs the miracle of turning water into wine.
This is a perfect parallel. Producing a high-quality wine is a process entirely dictated by strict chronological chemical cycles. You have to plant the vineyard, wait for the vines to mature, rely on seasonal weather, harvest the grapes, crush them, and then you have to endure the long, slow process of fermentation and aging in barrels to develop the complex flavor profile. It demands time.
But at the wedding in Cana, Jesus bypassed the entire chronological sequence. He took plain water and instantly produced a fully finished, mature product. And the biblical text notes that the master of the banquet, essentially the lead ensologist, tasted it and was astounded by the exceptional quality.
If you took a sample of that Cana wine to a modern chemical laboratory today, the chemists would analyze the tannins, the complex molecular esters, and the specific fermentation markers. The physical data would lead them to swear under oath that this liquid had been slowly aging in a dark cellar for decades. It possessed a deep physical history of chemical maturation that had never actually lived.
So Mota establishes this precedent. We have a biological example of created maturity in Adam and a chemical example in the wine. He then takes this established theological principle and applies it on a macro scale directly to the astrophysics of the cosmos.
This is where the synthesis happens. When our modern astronomers look through the James Webb telescope at galaxies that are billions of light years away, and they measure the redshift of that light and calculate the life cycle of those distant stars, they are doing excellent, accurate science. They are correctly reading the physical data. The universe genuinely, physically looks 14 billion years old. Its systems reflect a massive amount of historical development.
But Mota suggests that, precisely like Adam's bone structure or the complex tannins in the wine, the universe may have been brought into existence with an apparent age.
The argument is that God did not simply create a primitive, chaotic seed of a universe that required 14 billion years of slow, unguided, random evolution to eventually stumble into a habitable state. Just as Adam required an instantly functional body to survive, the universe was brought forth fully mature, highly complex, and instantly functional with its immense physical history already set in motion.
The cosmos was created in flight. Under this framework, the light from a star situated millions of light years away didn't need millions of years to reach Earth. The star and the stream of photons connecting it to Earth were created simultaneously, already in transit. The galaxies were instantiated already in a state of majestic expansion. The thermodynamic systems were activated, fully operational.
The stage was instantly set, fully matured and calibrated, so that it could immediately serve as the habitable theater for human life. Mota uses this to resolve the tension entirely. The scientific measurements aren't wrong, and God isn't tricking our equipment. He simply created a complete, mature system that inherently implies a history in order to be functional in the present.
Viewed through this lens, the violent expansion of the Big Bang isn't a slow, blind accident of physics. It is the immediate physical echo of the divine command, "Let there be light." It is the exact instant where cosmic maturity was established by the will of the transcendent cause.
It's an incredibly elegant framework.
Yeah.
But if we accept Mota's premise that the universe was created instantly functional and mature, it forces us to address one final, very specific textual problem in the Genesis account itself. It's a chronological paradox that skeptics and critics point out constantly.
The sequence of the creation days.
Exactly. If the universe is a fully functional logical system, what do we make of the specific order of the 6 days of creation? Genesis states that light, the cycle of day and night, and even biological plant life are created across days 1, 2, and 3. But the text explicitly states that the sun and the moon aren't created or placed in the sky until day 4.
From a scientific and logical standpoint, it presents a massive contradiction. How can a God of ultimate order establish an effect like the biological process of photosynthesis required for the plant life on day 3, without the presence of the necessary cause, the solar radiation from the sun?
Mota offers a deeply researched analytical resolution to this paradox, and it requires us to look very closely at the grammatical structure of that very first verse again, Genesis 1.1.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Mota argues that this opening statement is not merely a poetic title or a broad summary of the chapter. It is a definitive foundational action. It encompasses the physical creation of the entire cosmic infrastructure. When the text says the heavens, it includes the spatial dimensions, the distant galaxies, and the stars. And when it says the earth, Mota suggests it is scientifically and textually reasonable to infer the simultaneous creation of the entire local system, the solar system.
Meaning that the sun, the earth, and the moon were already physically present and structurally complete from the very first verse. They weren't missing for the first 3 days.
Mota reinforces this by pointing out that the text uses the specific cycle of evening and morning to demarcate the first 3 days in the exact same literary way it describes the days after the sun is explicitly mentioned. For that cycle to possess any physical or literary coherence, it implies that the Earth was already completing a diurnal rotation relative to a fixed, directional light source, namely the sun.
Okay, so if the sun and the moon were already physically present, burning in the sky since verse 1, what exactly is happening on day 4? Why did the Genesis text say, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens" on the 4th day?
Mota resolves this by introducing a widely discussed model among biblical researchers, the concept of the vapor envolvente, or the enveloping vapor canopy.
And this is where the atmospheric science gets really compelling. Let's visualize the early Earth according to Mota's model. He suggests that in its initial primordial stages, the Earth was completely enveloped in a massive, incredibly thick, dense layer of atmospheric clouds, gases, and suspended water vapor. Imagine a planetary fog so dense that it completely obscured the sky.
This primordial vapor canopy would possess very specific optical properties. It would allow diffuse, scattered light to penetrate down to the surface. It would be enough ambient light to clearly distinguish day from night as the Earth rotated. And crucially, it would allow enough diffuse solar radiation to easily sustain the early vegetation that was called forth on day 3.
But if you were an observer standing on the surface of the Earth during those first 3 days, you would never be able to look up and see the distinct, sharp shapes of the sun, the moon, or the stars. The sky would simply be a bright, hazy, featureless blanket.
Therefore, Mota argues, on day 4, God did not physically forge the sun and the moon out of nothing. The action of day 4 was one of revelation, not primary creation.
The text suggests God dissipated that massive vapor canopy. He cleared the planetary fog, and suddenly, for the first time from the vantage point of the Earth's surface, the celestial bodies became sharply, distinctly visible in the firmament. Their specific functional purpose was established, to serve as clear, observable markers for signs, seasons, days, and years for the ecosystem below.
It represents a fundamental shift in the Earth's atmosphere, moving from opacity to transparency. The structural architecture was built in verse 1, the environment was seeded, and on day 4, the luminaries were revealed in their full functional glory to regulate the newly mature biological system.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Water doesn't just use the vapor envolvente to solve a textual timeline problem. He explores the profound secondary physical effects this massive vapor canopy would have exerted on the planet before it eventually collapsed. Because if the entire globe was wrapped in a dense blanket of water vapor, it would act as an extreme planetary greenhouse.
The climatological implications of a global greenhouse canopy are massive. Mota points out that it would trap and distribute solar heat incredibly efficiently, creating a uniform, subtropical climate across almost the entire surface of the planet from pole to pole.
Which Mota argues could elegantly explain some of the major anomalies in the geological record, like why paleontologists frequently discovered the fossilized remains of lush, tropical vegetation and warm weather animals buried beneath the ice in extreme Arctic environments. The Earth's temperature was globally regulated by the canopy.
Furthermore, this dense canopy would act as a formidable biological shield. It would severely filter out harmful cosmic radiation, solar flares, and the intense ultraviolet rays that degrade cellular DNA and accelerate aging.
Mota suggests this enhanced biological protection, combined with a hyper-oxygenated atmosphere, could be the actual physical mechanism behind the extreme longevity of the biblical patriarchs described in the early chapters of Genesis. Men like Methuselah living for over 900 years. The physical environment was simply vastly less damaging to cellular regeneration than our current exposed atmosphere.
And finally, Mota notes that this colossal reservoir of suspended atmospheric vapor provides a direct physical explanation for the source of the cataclysmic waters of the Great Flood. When the structural integrity of that canopy finally collapsed and condensed, it resulted in the catastrophic 40-day global torrential rainfall vividly described in the narrative of Noah.
It is genuinely remarkable how Mota manages to weave astrophysics, thermodynamics, atmospheric science, and the ancient biblical text into a single, cohesive, logically tight narrative. He completely changes the paradigm of how you approach both the scientific data and the scripture.
That is the ultimate triumph of Mota's work in this chapter. He successfully demonstrates that when we look deeply enough, the physical sciences and the theological texts are not competing mutually exclusive stories. They are complementary perspectives of the exact same reality.
So let's pull all of this together and synthesize the massive journey we've taken today. We started by looking up at the night sky, confronting that sense of vast, dizzying vertigo. And through Mota's framework, we found that the Big Bang theory isn't a secular weapon designed to dismantle faith. When properly understood as a theory of cosmic development, not absolute origination, it looks remarkably like the physical expanding echo of the divine command, "Let there be light."
We examine how the stretching of light waves via the redshift proves a dynamically expanding universe, and how the unrelenting laws of thermodynamics, the inevitable increase of systemic entropy, prove that the universe cannot be eternally old. It is burning finite fuel. It had to have a definitive starting point.
A starting point that logically demanded a transcendent cause, omnipotent and eternal, to bring it into existence out of absolute nothingness, perfectly mirroring the unique Hebrew concept of bara creation ex nihilo.
And by integrating the theological concept of maturitate creata, or created maturity, understanding that God can instantiate a fully functional, highly complex universe just as he instantiated a mature atom, we seamlessly resolve the apparent tension between the billions of years of measurable cosmic history and the biblical narrative of purposeful, immediate creation.
Whether you are looking through the lens of a radio telescope, measuring the faint microwave background of the initial expansion, or reading the ancient Hebrew text describing the clearing of the enveloping vapor on day 4, Mota argues you are ultimately exploring the exact same masterpiece. Reason and faith are not at war. They are walking hand in hand, reading the exact same book.
It is a framework that requires intellectual rigor on both the scientific and the theological fronts, but it yields a much more unified understanding of reality.
It truly is a paradigm-shifting way to view the cosmos. But before we wrap up, we want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought that stems from all of this. We spent a lot of time today talking about the sheer math. We talked about the staggering, incomprehensible vastness of the expanding galaxies and the infinitesimally microscopic reality of the initial singularity.
And crucially, we discussed the fine-tuning. That 1 in 10 to the 60th power precision required for the fundamental forces of physics to simply allow matter to coalesce into a life-sustaining environment.
Exactly. If the cosmos was truly engineered by a transcendent cause, with that level of terrifying mathematical precision, and if, as the concept of creative maturity suggests, it was brought forth instantly ready, fully mature, with its systems fully active, and the stage instantly set for human life, well, it means the universe wasn't just a blind, chaotic accident that eventually stumbled into producing us. It means the universe was waiting for you.
It shifts the perspective from cosmic insignificance to profound, deliberate intentionality. You are not a byproduct. You are the intended inhabitant of the architecture.
We spend so much of our lives looking up at the stars, wondering where we came from, and often feeling incredibly small, almost irrelevant, in the face of all that massive space and deep time. But if Ozair da Silva Mota's grand synthesis is correct, if all of this, the billions of swirling galaxies, the relentless laws of thermodynamics, the perfectly balanced fundamental constants, was meticulously, specifically calibrated for our immediate existence on this pale blue dot, then the far more urgent question isn't where we came from.
The origin has been established. The stage has been set.
The lights are on. The real question is, now that the universe has gone to such unimaginable mathematical lengths to put you here, breathing in this specific moment in time, what are you supposed to do with your time in the spotlight?
That is the ultimate question. The physics and the theology can point toward the purpose, but only the individual can answer it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into Moja's work. It's been an absolute mind-bender of a journey exploring the intersection of the scientific and the divine, and we hope it gave you some incredible new frameworks to think about. Until next time, keep looking up and keep asking the big questions.